This being the Christmas season, I'm going to give a quick explanation of the real history of A Christmas Carol. So, first of all, it's very common that the famous person who puts out some work of art, music or literature, most obviously in music, is not always the originator of that piece of work. As a matter of fact, most often a famous singer or a musician is not really the composer of the piece that makes him famous. So this was also true in literature, especially in the 19th century, that a great many of the works that are now famous were not written by the people who claimed them or who are assumed to have written them. That was the case with the Christmas Carol. It's not outrageous. It's not unbelievable. It's perfectly normal, okay, for this to happen. So the gist of this is that in 1842, Charles Dickens came to America on his tour, and he would have met Matthew Franklin Whittier, myself, in my past life. And he would have been introduced to Matthew by Matthew's personal friend, Oliver Wendell Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes was instrumental in inviting Dickens to Boston and in setting up the welcome dinner. So there were 150, as I understand, young literary figures, authors in America who were invited to that dinner. And Matthew, I know, was a fan because he talks about Martin Chuzzlewit to his brother in correspondence. So if he was a fan and if he was good personal friends with Oliver Wendell Holmes, he definitely would have been given an introduction. Now, I have proof that Matthew wrote Dickens a letter because Dickens' secretary responded to it, acknowledged a letter. There's an acknowledgement of a letter from Matthew to Dickens, which was written on the tour, like a month later on the same tour. The only part in Dickens' hand is his signature, which means that the secretary sent out form letters thanking people for their letters to Dickens, and Dickens would just sign them. He probably never read any of the letters. I'm sure it was one heck of a letter because Matthew was an excellent correspondent, excellent letter writer, and if he was a fan, it would have been a wonderful letter, but Dickens probably never read it. The correspondence was destroyed when Dickens went back to England. Now, we have to briefly go back to 1836 when there appears in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine in the April 1836 edition a story called The Unbidden Guest. That was signed Trismegistus. That was Matthew Franklin Whittier. I can definitely prove that. He'd used that signature as early as 1828. So that was a story that Dickens clearly plagiarized from in order to write the 29th chapter of the Pickwick Papers, the story of the goblins who stole a sexton. That was 8 months later that Dickens came out with that story. He would have had in front of him this story by Matthew, The Unbidden Guest, and another unpublished story called The New Year's Bells, which Matthew must have submitted to a London magazine. Dickens must have snagged it somehow. So when Dickens wrote that story about the goblins, he had in front of him both of Matthew's stories, one published, one unpublished. It's obvious that almost nothing in that story by Dickens was original. It was all Matthew's work, Matthew and his wife Abby's work, probably, the New Year's Bells. And that the story of the goblins that stole a sexton was not Dickens' precursor to A Christmas Carol. It was Mathew and Abby's precursor to A Christmas Carol, okay, essentially. I mean, they were the ones that came up with the ideas. There are no original ideas practically in that story that Dickens used. So that's a long story going back to that. We're going to fast forward now to 1838, and Mathew and Abby had lost their little son Joseph. They had temporarily moved in with Matthew's second cousin, Richard Whittier, in Methuen, Massachusetts, which is right nearby their native Haverhill, Massachusetts. They had most recently come from Amesbury. These are all little towns in the same area. And they had this tragedy that they just lost their son, and Abby was beside herself. Matthew was afraid he was going to lose her, I believe, extrapolating from all the evidence I have. and Matthew couldn't work. He had to stick with her, and I think he pulled her out of it by going back to something they had written earlier, the New Year's Bells, which was a redemption story. And they, I believe, had talked about how to best help mankind, how to alleviate mankind's suffering. You had to go to the root cause of that suffering, which was spiritual ignorance, which meant that there had to be a mass turning of the heart in order for mankind to be saved, to progress. And the best way to do that was to bring them through a story. So they would identify with the main character, and the main character would go through a conversion, a turning of the heart, and each reader would identify with that and vicariously go through that experience. So Abby was a musician. She was both a literary and a musical prodigy. I have evidence for all of that. She would have wanted to call the chapters staves, not only because it was musical, but because it had a double hidden meaning, a meaning that Charles Dickens never picked up on, and that is that a stave can also be a rung on a ladder. So each chapter was a rung on the ladder towards this conversion experience that they were wanting to bring each reader through. And the hope was that if they could get this story out to a vast number of people, that they could help to cause vast numbers of people to go through a conversion experience. That was the idea. It was a little naive of them, but nonetheless, that was their conception. But Abby died in March of 1841 of consumption before that could ever be done. So in 1842, it had only been a few months after Abby's death, and Matthew was kind of trying to wrap everything up as best he could. And there was this issue of A Christmas Carol, that they never had been able to finish, to accomplish. And Matthew saw the best way to accomplish this was to somehow induce Charles Dickens to publish it. See, and then it would reach this vast audience that they had envisioned. So when Dickens came to Boston in 1842, Matthew would have been invited among the 150 young literary figures, because Matthew had been publishing anonymously since he was a boy of 12 in 1825. He was a well-established author. He'd been personal friends with Oliver Wendell Holmes since 1831, when he was publishing Holmes' poetry in New York City, when he was editing the New York Constellation under editor-in-chief Asa Green. So they go way back. Matthew's work is cheek to jowl with Oliver Wendell Holmes' work in the New England Magazine in 1831, when Oliver Wendell Holmes was publishing the Autocrat at the Breakfast Table. Matthew's work is right next to his, before or after, I can't remember. So they were contemporaries, and Matthew was helping Oliver Wendell Holmes gain exposure just the way he was doing for his brother when he was editing the New York Constellation. So they went way back. So that means that Matthew definitely would have had a personal introduction to Charles Dickens. So having this idea in mind of spreading his and Abby's work out to the world as kind of a tribute to her, posthumously, he would have given this manuscript to Charles Dickens. Dickens received many manuscripts. We know that he destroyed the correspondence, but not that he destroyed the manuscripts necessarily. So when Dickens got back from his American trip, his career was sagging. He was sarcastic in American Notes about America. Americans didn't like it. As I understand, I haven't read it, but I understand he was sarcastic about America in Martin Chuzzlewit, and he was losing his American audience. And apparently in England, they didn't like it that much either. So he was afraid of falling into debt because his career was sagging, and he lived, pretty nice lifestyle, had a family to support, and his father had fallen into debt when he was a child. He was terrified of it. So he would have gone back through this pile of manuscripts that he'd received in America. And he would have noticed the Whittier name, which was already well known at that time, I think, in 1843. And he would have started reading it, and he would have realized that he had the potential for a pot boiler. A pot boiler is something you can publish that'll just get you some money, see? To him, it was a ghost story and an opportunity to get out of debt. That's all. He didn't understand the depth of it. He never understood that the staves, had a double meaning. He just liked the musical sound of it because it was called A Christmas Carol. Well, they called it A Christmas Carol because the one that Matthew and Abby were working from as a template was the New Year's bells. So they just switched out the holiday and kept the musical theme. Um, so Dickens reworked this thing, and what he did was to stretch out Matthew's prose, kind of pad it, because Matthew believed in crisp writing. We know that. And Dickens liked to pad things out and be verbose. So if you look at Dickens' handwritten draft, which is probably about the second one, you'll see that a lot of what he did was not really revising anything he'd written. He was taking somebody else's work and padding it out so it looked like his style and stretching it out. Probably he wanted a novel to be a little longer. Where Abby did the writing, now Abby's writing has to do with the ghosts and the spirits and the occult and the paranormal and mysticism and Catholic mysticism because she was raised Catholic. So Abby had two different sources of influence. Her mother taught her the occult, the paranormal, the mysticism. We have on record that Abby says that her mother taught her about the fairies, for example. Her mother was from a Scottish background, but there would have been much more astrology, palm reading, and so on. These things show up in her other short stories. Another thing that shows up in her other short stories is characters like Tiny Tim. There's 4 characters like Tiny Tim in Abby's other short stories. So what Dickens did was to secularize their manuscript and stretch it out to make it longer and dumb it down for public consumption. This is typical of what somebody famous does with a real work of genius. A real work of genius is too advanced for the public. So the popularizer has to dumb it down for the public. And, Dickens had gotten his reputation partly from plagiarizing the work of real geniuses, but partly he had a particular ability to appeal to the masses. He knew how to titillate the masses and give them what they wanted. So he turned A Christmas Carol into something that would be more generally popular. And we probably never would have heard of it had he not done this. His explanation, see, the problem is that he just thought it was a potboiler and a ghost story. He loved ghost stories, but he didn't believe in spiritualism or he didn't believe in any of these things. When Abby wrote these things, she wrote them as her authentic beliefs, and she embedded in them authentic occult teachings. Dickens didn't know these teachings. He didn't put authentic occult teachings in any of his other Christmas stories. It's a total mismatch. He couldn't possibly have written A Christmas Carol. And I can prove this. If you read my paper, I can prove it. That somebody worldly and secular dumbed down the work of someone who had deeply studied the mysteries. It's in my paper, okay? We've got this 100% smoking gun proved. There's also another smoking gun that shows that Dickens took the work of a Catholic and secularized it. Okay, so I've got him. I just have to get people to actually read the paper. So what Dickens did is he had this classic of spiritual literature that was deeply impacting people. Even the watered down version that he had created was deeply impacting people. And suddenly he was seen as the author of an inspired spiritual work, which he was not. He was a worldly guy. He wasn't a spiritual guy. So he had to play the part. And one of the ways he played the part was to pretend that he had written it in a fit of genius in 6 weeks, the way that Handel wrote the Messiah. So he described himself as walking the black streets of London many a night, alternately weeping and laughing. See, in other words, he had to give the impression of a genius, inspired genius who was, getting the message or whatever, at walking at night. See, well, that was just he's an actor, okay? So that was his role, his imagination as to what it would be like to be an actual inspired genius, and everybody bought it. See, it was absolute BS. So he wasn't doing that at all. He was reworking somebody else's manuscript hurriedly in 6 weeks so that he could get it published in time for Christmas and get his ass out of debt. See, that's what really happened with this thing. And at first, Matthew was pleased that he had accomplished his and Abby's objective. Later on, he realized how much Dickens had dumbed down and distorted Abby's original work, see? and he regretted that. I think he continued to be a fan for some years. He even signed as Dickens Jr., but at one point for a little series. But here's the thing, Matthew was writing in this style, in what we would consider Dickens' style in a sense, except that Matthew had heart and was a deeply spiritual person, but in this kind of easy, fun, colloquial style. Matthew was writing in that before Dickens ever published. Matthew was a child prodigy, publishing in a major Boston literary newspaper at age 12 in 1825 before Dickens ever published anything. And Matthew was editing, underneath Asa Green, he was editing the New York Constellation in 1830, 1831, 1832. That newspaper was available in England. Technically, Charles Dickens could have been influenced by Matthew's writing. No doubt both of them were influenced by other popular writers that came before them. But it's Matthew's style in A Christmas Carol, the opening to A Christmas Carol, the puns and everything that you see in there, the humor, that's Matthew, that's not Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens' contribution to that was to pad it out. And if you look at what was there in the handwritten draft and compare it to what's in the printed version, he made it worse. Dickens made that introduction worse, not better, by stretching it out unnecessarily, see, adding superfluous garbage to it, basically. So it's an example of something that happens all the time. The famous guy didn't originate the work of genius. So all I can say is that, I have the evidence, and I've submitted a scholarly paper that I took my original, which was quite long because it had all the evidence in it. It's not my opinions in there, it's evidence, one after another, after another, after another. So I trimmed that down to scholarly size and submitted that to a couple different journals, and they didn't even bother to read it. They just automatically dismissed it because it couldn't possibly, it couldn't possibly be so. So therefore, they didn't look at any of the evidence. They didn't expose themselves to any of the evidence. So all I can say is read the paper with an open mind and expose yourself to the evidence.